Alright, so over the course of a single season, I believe fishing big streamers will put more big trout in the net than all other methods combined. Now let me repeat that. Over the course of a single season, I believe fishing big streamers will put more big trout in the net than all other methods combined. Now, I am by no means the first person to come across with such a hypothesis, but I have wholeheartedly bought into such an idea. Now, before I get into a more full explanation, I want to kind of give a little bit of background. So for those that don't know, a streamer, when I say a big streamer, I'm talking about something like 4 or 5 inches. It imitates like a bait fish or just another smaller trout, something like that. Basically, another fish in which a fish can eat. And then when I say everything else, I'm talking about dry flies, wet flies, or nymphs. And what they are is just basically small aquatic insects, which most often are in their larval stage when they're in the water, unless they're dry flies that come down on the surface. But basically, they're a lot smaller. As you can see, we'll do a little size comparison. You have big streamer versus small little nymph. And so, again, I just want to reiterate, over the course of a season, I believe that big streamers will put more big trout in the net than all other methods combined. And so the first reason for this is that trout are territorial. And the bigger a trout gets, the more territorial behavior it expresses. On top of that, there's a natural pecking order in the stream. And the bigger trout tend to bully the smaller trout into taking the best habitat and the best holding lies where they have food, shelter, and all the necessities for life. And both of these ideas are both backed by multiple scientific studies, and it is why these ideas are widely accepted by fisheries biologists all across the country. And so basically, when you throw a big streamer into the habitat, you're invoking a territorial response, and often you get a trout that's not eating the fly simply because it is hungry, because as humans we bully with our feet or our hands, kicking, punching. Trout don't have that. They have their mouths. That's all they have. So their way of bullying is they nip, they charge, or they eat the smaller fish. And so when the smaller fish invades its territory, it comes along, it nips at it, and you catch it that way. And so the reason why big streamers are better in the sense of catching these bigger trout, this invokes a territorial response. Well, this small little guy right here is not nearly big enough to cause a territorial response. He just thinks it's a normal larvae swimming on by, and it just kind of leaves it alone. On top of that, big flies like this tend to exclude smaller fish most often. I say often because I've been proven wrong. I've caught fish just as big as my streamer before. It's kind of funny, but so I say most often big flies exclude small fish, and that's a good thing. As you see, these big fish, while they have their own territory and their own habitat, they don't own the whole stream, and oftentimes outside of their territory there's what I refer to as satellite fish. And satellite fish are smaller fish outside that territory, basically in their own little territory. It's obviously not as big as that big trout, but basically they're surrounding that area. And so when you fish a nymph, a dry, a wet fly, you're more susceptible to catch those satellite fish. And these big trout didn't get that way by not knowing what's up, and so they often watch these satellite fish, and that's how they determine what's going on around them. And if they need to flight, if their life's endangered, that is often hinted at by how those satellite fish are reacting. So if you hook and you play one of these smaller fish, these smaller satellite fish around the big fish, you could potentially put down these other fish. And so when you're fishing a bigger streamer, you kind of avoid those takes for those smaller fish. They kind of ignore your fly. They're not big enough to eat it. And so you don't end up spooking those fish because they don't come after and eat it, and you risk putting them down. On top of that, the final reason I have is that streamer fishing versus any other type of fishing, it's a different mentality. When you're nymph fishing, dry fly fishing, wet fly fishing, you're covering each seam methodically. You're kind of breaking down the entire river into smaller streams, different currents and whatnot. And so what you do is you're working the same seam over and over and over again, and then you're moving upstream like 3 feet and doing it again, which makes sense because there's such a variety of larvae and whatnot in the water, and so you kind of have to throw it multiple times. While you often do catch them on your first cast, there's a more likelihood that you'll catch them on a later cast. But when you're fishing a bigger streamer, you cover a much greater volume of water with just a single cast. And so this territorial response to these bigger fish is typically going to happen on that first or second cast. And so you don't have to stand there all day casting to the same spot, and instead you can keep moving, make a few casts, work the streamer. If you don't move a fish, it's either not a fish there or he's not interested, he's just kind of like, whatever, you can kind of go through my territory today, or I'm not hungry. But then you move on. And so the more water you cover, the greater probability, it's just simple probability theory. The more water you cover, the greater probability you're going to get your fly in front of a big fish. And so, like I said, I'm no expert. I have been, I've only been streamer fishing now for, I'd say, a little less than a year. And, I'm by no means an expert. I've been nymphing for a lot longer. But basically, to restate the streamer hypothesis, over the course of a single season, I believe that fishing big streamers will put more big trout in the net than all other methods combined.